May 5th, 1945. General George S. Patton's Third Army was driving deep into Czechoslovakia. They had just covered 600 miles in 3 months. They had crossed the Rhine, liberated Bavaria, and were pushing toward Pilsen and Prague. To the north, General William Simpson's Ninth Army had crossed the Elbe River near Magdeburg, 50 miles from Berlin. To the south, Patton's forces were advancing into territory the Soviets expected to occupy. The German army was collapsing on all fronts. Patton believed his Third Army should keep advancing. Soviet forces were still fighting their way into Berlin. American armies had momentum. The path east was open. Why stop now when they could occupy as much territory as possible before Germany surrendered? The answer came directly from Eisenhower, who had coordinated secretly with Stalin. All American forces will halt at pre-designated lines. No further advances into Soviet-designated zones. Simpson's Ninth Army would not advance on Berlin. Patton's Third Army would halt short of Prague. The orders were absolute. Patton didn't just disagree. He looked at the map and saw a crime in progress. He watched the fuel gauges on his Shermans. He had the gas. He looked at the Wehrmacht reports. The enemy was broken. He had the most powerful army in American history, ready to snap the spine of the Soviet advance. And now, a piece of paper signed by politicians 3 months ago was acting like a brick wall. He was a racehorse being reined in inches from the finish line, and the order wasn't just stopping his tanks. It was saving the enemy. He demanded an explanation from Eisenhower. Why were they stopping? Why were they letting the Soviets occupy Prague when Third Army could get there first? Why were they giving Stalin half of Europe? Eisenhower's answer wasn't military. It was political. There had been a conference in February. Roosevelt had met with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta. Agreements had been signed about occupation zones and spheres of influence. The lines on the map had already been drawn. Patton's response was immediate. Then Roosevelt gave it all away. Eisenhower didn't disagree, but he told Patton the decision was final. They would stop where the Yalta agreements said to stop. American forces would not advance into Soviet-designated territory. What Patton didn't know was that the agreement stopping him had been negotiated 3 months earlier by a dying president who kept the terms secret from the American public and from his own vice president. February 4th, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt arrived at Yalta in the Crimea for a conference with Churchill and Stalin. The meeting would determine how the war ended and what Europe looked like afterward. The American public knew the conference was happening. What they didn't know was what Roosevelt was about to agree to. Roosevelt was dying. He had severe cardiovascular disease. His blood pressure was dangerously high. His hands shook. His face was gaunt. He could barely stay awake through meetings. Stalin, meanwhile, was sharp, rested, and predatory. He looked across the table and didn't see a superpower rival. He saw a dying man. Every time Roosevelt's hand shook, every time his voice trailed off, Stalin saw an opening to push the border of the Soviet Union 100 miles west. The tragedy of Yalta wasn't just that Roosevelt was sick. It was that his weakness became the Soviet Union's strength. Churchill looked at Roosevelt and was horrified by what he saw. This wasn't the man he had worked with for 3 years. This was someone who should have been in a hospital, not negotiating the future of the world with Stalin. But Roosevelt insisted on conducting the negotiations personally. He sidelined his own State Department. He ignored Churchill's warnings about Soviet intentions. He believed he could charm Stalin into cooperation. The conference lasted 8 days. Roosevelt met with Stalin privately, multiple times without Churchill present. He made concessions Churchill didn't know about until afterward. He agreed to terms that would shape Europe for the next 45 years, and he kept almost all of it secret from the American people. Stalin came to Yalta with a clear list of demands. He wanted Soviet control of Poland. He wanted influence over Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. He wanted occupation rights in Germany. He wanted everything the Red Army was currently standing on to remain under Soviet authority. Churchill objected immediately. Britain had gone to war in 1939 to defend Polish independence. The Polish government in exile was in London. Free elections had been promised. Churchill insisted Poland couldn't simply be handed to Stalin. Roosevelt sided with Stalin. He told Churchill that Soviet security interests had to be respected. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people defeating Germany. They deserved a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. Churchill had to accept reality. Churchill argued that accepting Soviet domination meant betraying millions of people who had fought alongside the Allies. Poles had served in British units. They had fought at Monte Cassino. They had flown in the Battle of Britain. What message did it send to give their country to Stalin? Roosevelt dismissed Churchill's concerns. He said Stalin had promised free elections in Poland. The Soviet Union would allow democratic governments to form. Churchill could trust Stalin's word. The war had changed Stalin. He was a partner now, not a threat. Churchill looked at Roosevelt and realized he was losing the argument. The American president was either naive or too sick to understand what he was agreeing to. Either way, Stalin was going to get everything he wanted. The Yalta agreements included a secret protocol. It wasn't published. It wasn't shared with Congress. The American public never saw it. Even Harry Truman, the vice president, wasn't told what it said. The protocol divided Europe into spheres of influence. The Soviet Union would control Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. They would have dominant influence in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Germany would be divided into occupation zones with Berlin deep inside the Soviet sector. In exchange for this, Stalin promised to enter the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat. He promised to allow free elections in Poland. He promised to work with the United Nations to maintain peace after the war. Roosevelt believed he had negotiated a fair compromise. Stalin got security on his western border. The United States got help defeating Japan. Everyone won. The alliance would continue into peacetime. Churchill knew better. He had dealt with Stalin since 1941. He knew Stalin's promises meant nothing. Free elections in Poland would never happen. The Soviet occupation would become permanent. The divide was being drawn across Europe while Roosevelt smiled and shook Stalin's hand. But Roosevelt was the senior partner in the alliance. American forces outnumbered British forces. American industry was financing the war. Roosevelt made the decisions. Churchill could object, but he couldn't stop what was happening. The conference ended on February 11th, 1945. The Big Three signed the Yalta Accords. Stalin returned to Moscow having won everything he wanted. Churchill returned to London, knowing he had just witnessed the betrayal of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt returned to Washington and told the American public that Yalta had been a great success. Roosevelt addressed Congress on March 1, 1945, to report on the Yalta Conference. He sat in a chair to deliver the speech. He couldn't stand for long periods anymore. His voice was weak. He stumbled over words. He told Congress that Yalta had achieved a new framework for peace. The Soviet Union had committed to free elections in Poland. Germany would be demilitarized and democratized. The United Nations would prevent future wars. It was a triumph of diplomacy. He didn't mention the secret protocol dividing Europe into spheres of influence. He didn't mention that Poland's borders had been redrawn, giving Stalin Ukrainian and Belarusian territory. Reporters asked about the specifics of the agreement. Roosevelt deflected. He said details were still being worked out. He said Stalin had been reasonable and cooperative. He said Churchill had supported everything. The important thing was that the alliance held together. Congressional leaders accepted Roosevelt's explanation. They trusted his judgment. He had led the country through the Depression and through the war. If he said Yalta was a success, it must be true. But Roosevelt knew the truth. He knew Stalin wasn't going to allow free elections. He knew the Soviet occupation would be permanent. He knew he had given away Eastern Europe to maintain an alliance that would dissolve the moment Germany surrendered. And he knew he was dying. Within weeks, maybe days, he would never have to defend what he had done. That burden would fall to whoever came next. 36 days after Roosevelt lied to Congress about Yalta, he was dead. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. He died at 3:35 p.m. Vice President Harry Truman was drinking bourbon with House Speaker Sam Rayburn when the call came. The White House needed him immediately. When Truman arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt told him the president was dead. Truman asked what he could do for her. Eleanor Roosevelt looked at him and said, "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." She was right. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. Roosevelt had barely spoken to him. He had been kept away from strategic planning, excluded from major decisions, and told almost nothing about foreign policy. Roosevelt had kept Truman in the dark about everything that mattered. Now Truman was President of the United States in the middle of a world war, and he was about to discover just how much Roosevelt had hidden from him. Truman spent his first week as president reading briefing documents and meeting with military commanders. He discovered that Roosevelt had made dozens of commitments he knew nothing about. Agreements with Churchill, promises to Stalin, occupation plans for Germany and Japan. On April 20th, Truman met with Secretary of State Edward Stettinius to review the Yalta agreements in detail. Stettinius laid out the terms: Soviet control of Poland, division of Germany into occupation zones, Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan. Truman asked about Poland. What about free elections? What about the Polish government in exile? Stettinius explained that Stalin had promised elections would be held, but no date had been set. Soviet forces were already in Poland. They were installing a communist government. Truman was furious. Roosevelt had given Poland to Stalin in exchange for a promise everyone knew Stalin wouldn't keep. Millions of Poles would live under Soviet occupation because Roosevelt wanted Stalin's help with Japan. He asked about Germany. The briefing showed him the occupation zones. Berlin was 100 miles inside the Soviet zone. American and British forces would have to cross Soviet-controlled territory to reach it. The city would be divided into sectors, but the Soviets controlled access. Truman traced the lines on the map with his finger. Berlin, gone. Prague, gone. Vienna, deep inside the red zone. The lines didn't just represent territory. They represented the prison walls for millions of people. He realized with a sick feeling in his stomach that the American armies pushing east weren't liberators anymore. They were just walking to the edge of the cage Roosevelt had already built. The military situation on the ground didn't matter. Political agreements made in February were determining where armies could advance in April. And those agreements gave the Soviet Union control of half of Europe. Eisenhower had received his orders from the Combined Chiefs of Staff in March 1945. Allied forces would advance to pre-designated stop lines based on occupation zones agreed at Yalta. They would halt and wait for Soviet forces to arrive. Berlin was in the Soviet zone. American forces would not advance on the German capital. Eisenhower believed the orders were militarily sound. He also feared the National Redoubt, a supposed Nazi fortress in the Bavarian Alps, where Hitler's most fanatical troops would make a last stand. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were preparing for prolonged resistance in mountain strongholds. Because of this supposed fortress, Eisenhower turned Patton's Third Army south instead of letting him drive east to Prague. The National Redoubt proved to be a myth. No mountain fortress existed. By the time intelligence realized this, the Russians had already taken Prague. The hunt for a non-existent fortress cost the U.S. Army the chance to take Czechoslovakia. On May 7th, Germany surrendered. American forces were positioned in southern Germany and western Czechoslovakia. Soviet forces occupied Berlin, eastern Germany, Poland, and most of Czechoslovakia. The map of Europe had been redrawn exactly as Stalin wanted. By May 1945, Truman understood the full scope of what Roosevelt had agreed to at Yalta. The Soviet Union controlled 12 countries in Eastern Europe with a combined population of over 100 million people. Stalin had promised free elections. None had been held. In Poland, the Soviet NKVD was arresting members of the Polish resistance who had fought the Germans for 6 years. They were being sent to labor camps or executed. The Polish government in exile in London was powerless. Stalin had installed a communist puppet government in Warsaw. Across Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, Soviet forces were conducting systematic purges, dismantling factories, and installing communist governments under Soviet supervision. Truman met with Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, on April 23rd. He confronted Molotov about Poland. He told him the United States expected Stalin to honor his promise about free elections. The Soviet occupation was supposed to be temporary. Molotov was shocked by Truman's tone. Roosevelt had never spoken to him this way. Truman didn't care. He told Molotov that the United States would not accept permanent Soviet control of Eastern Europe. Agreements had to be honored. Molotov reported back to Stalin that the new American president was hostile and confrontational. Stalin interpreted this as evidence that the wartime alliance was ending. He accelerated the consolidation of Soviet control in occupied territories. Truman realized he was trapped by Roosevelt's legacy. The Yalta agreements had given Stalin everything he wanted. Truman couldn't reverse decisions Roosevelt had signed off on without appearing to break American commitments, and Stalin had no intention of honoring promises about free elections. Patton spent May 1945 watching Soviet forces consolidate control of Eastern Europe while American armies sat idle. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria, but his mind was on what wasn't happening to the east. He told his staff that the United States had defeated the wrong enemy. Germany was finished. The real threat was the Soviet Union. American forces should be pushing the Soviets out of Poland and Czechoslovakia, while they still had the strength and position to do it. His intelligence officers reported systematic Soviet atrocities, widespread violence against women in occupied territories, deportations of entire populations to labor camps, summary executions of anyone suspected of anti-communist sympathies. The Red Army was behaving worse than the Wehrmacht had in Western Europe. Patton met with liberated American POWs who had been held by Soviet forces. They described treatment worse than German captivity. Soviet soldiers had stolen their watches, boots, and rations. Officers who protested were beaten or shot. The Soviets didn't see Americans as allies. They saw everyone as potential enemies. On May 7th, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, Patton met with Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson in Austria. He made his case directly. "We could beat the Russians in 6 weeks," Patton told him. The Red Army was exhausted from 4 years of continuous combat. Soviet logistics were overstretched. American forces had complete air superiority. Patton submitted a detailed assessment of Soviet intentions. He predicted permanent occupation of Eastern Europe, communist expansion westward, and eventual military confrontation. He argued that May 1945 was the moment to act, while American forces were at peak strength and Soviet forces were overextended. Patterson listened, but made clear that Washington had no interest in Patton's recommendations. American soldiers wanted to go home. The public wanted peace. Congress was demanding rapid demobilization. Patton's aggressive rhetoric was politically impossible. Patton believed he was being punished for telling the truth. The Yalta agreements had tied American hands. Roosevelt's naive trust in Stalin had given away half of Europe. And now Patton was supposed to sit quietly while Soviet communism spread across the continent. Churchill had been warning about Soviet intentions since the Yalta Conference ended. In March 1945, he sent a telegram to Roosevelt saying, "Soviet Russia has become a mortal danger to the free world." Roosevelt had dismissed Churchill's concerns. After Roosevelt died, Churchill sent an urgent telegram to Truman on May 12, 1945, just days after Germany surrendered. "An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front," Churchill wrote. "We do not know what is going on behind it." This was the phrase that would define the Cold War. Beyond telegrams, Churchill pushed for military action. He urged Truman to keep American forces as far east as possible before Germany surrendered. He wanted Western armies to occupy Prague, Vienna, and Berlin before Soviet forces arrived. Eisenhower rejected Churchill's proposals. The Yalta Agreement specified occupation zones. American forces would not advance into territory designated for Soviet occupation. Political commitments had to be honored. Churchill watched helplessly as Soviet forces occupied territory the Western Allies could have taken. Prague fell to the Red Army when American forces were 50 miles away and could have reached it first. Vienna was occupied by Soviets, despite British forces being in position to advance. In May 1945, Churchill ordered the British Chiefs of Staff to prepare Operation Unthinkable. It was a military plan to push Soviet forces out of Poland using American, British, and rearmed German units fighting together. The plan assumed immediate offensive action, while Western armies were still mobilized. The British chiefs analyzed the plan and concluded it was militarily feasible if launched immediately. They estimated Allied forces could defeat Soviet armies in Eastern Europe within months, but they warned it would require total commitment and would result in heavy casualties. Churchill sent the plan to Truman. Truman rejected it immediately. The American public would never accept attacking the Soviet Union. The war in Europe had just ended. Nobody wanted to start another war immediately. For the Polish people, the betrayal was physical. They had spent 6 years waiting for the white stars of the U.S. Army to appear on the horizon. They had listened to the BBC, hearing promises of freedom. Instead, they watched the Red Army roll in. They traded one Gestapo for another. The uniforms changed from gray to green, but the midnight knocks on the door remained exactly the same. Poland lost 6 million people during World War II, nearly 20% of its pre-war population. Polish forces had fought alongside the Allies from the first day of the war to the last. They expected liberation, Instead, they got a new occupation. The Soviet NKVD arrested over 50,000 members of the Polish Home Army between 1944 and 1946. These were resistance fighters who had battled the Germans for 6 years. Stalin considered them enemies because they were loyal to the Polish government in exile, not to his puppet regime in Warsaw. Czechoslovakia had been betrayed once before at Munich in 1938 when Britain and France gave the Sudetenland to Hitler. In 1945, they were betrayed again, despite having fought with the Allies. Despite being a democracy before the war, Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet domination. By 1948, communist parties controlled every government in Soviet-occupied Europe. Free elections had never been held. Opposition parties were banned. Anti-communists were in prison or dead. The Iron Curtain was permanent. The total population under Soviet control by 1950 was over 100 million people in Eastern Europe alone. They would remain under communist dictatorships for 45 years. Millions would be imprisoned, tortured, or killed for opposing the regimes Stalin installed. And it all traced back to February 1945, when a dying American president agreed to Soviet control in exchange for promises he knew wouldn't be kept. Patton's warnings about the Soviet threat made headlines in June 1945. He told reporters that the United States should maintain a strong military presence in Europe to counter Soviet expansion. He suggested rearming German units to help defend against communism. The American press was horrified. Columnist Drew Pearson wrote that Patton's statements raised serious questions about his judgment. The New York Times editorialized that Patton seemed intent on starting another war. Time magazine questioned whether his aggressive personality was suited for peacetime leadership. None of these outlets investigated what Patton was actually observing in Europe. None reported on Soviet atrocities. None examined whether his warnings had merit. The narrative was set. Patton was a warmonger who couldn't adjust to peace. By August 1945, Washington was receiving pressure to remove Patton from command. He had angered the press with his denazification comments. He made a career-ending error. He told reporters that, in his view, the Nazi Party was just like the Democrats and Republicans, merely a political party that had lost. The press crucified him. The statement was tone-deaf, but it gave Eisenhower political cover for what everyone knew was really happening. Patton wouldn't stop warning about the Soviets. That was the real problem. His comments embarrassed an administration trying to maintain the wartime alliance with Stalin. Truman wanted cooperation with the Soviet Union, not confrontation. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of Third Army. The official reason was his denazification comments. Everyone understood the real reason. Patton had become politically toxic because he told uncomfortable truths about Soviet intentions. On December 9, 1945, Patton was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car collided with an army truck. He suffered severe spinal injuries that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He died on December 21st, 1945, 12 days after the accident. He was 60 years old. He never lived to see the complete vindication of his warnings about Soviet intentions. The car accident didn't just kill a general. It silenced the loudest warning siren in the West. With Patton gone, it became much easier for Washington to pretend the Soviet Union was still an ally. There was no one left with the stars, the stature, and the fearlessness to stand up and say, "We made a mistake." Everything Patton predicted came true. By 1946, Soviet forces had consolidated control over Poland East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Free elections promised that Yalta never happened. In 1948, a communist coup overthrew the democratic government in Czechoslovakia. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk was found dead in his pajamas under his bathroom window. The communist authorities claimed he jumped. The rest of the world knew he was pushed. The pattern repeated across Eastern Europe. Soviet occupation became permanent communist dictatorship. The Iron Curtain Churchill warned about in 1945 became the defining feature of European politics for 45 years. The Cold War that Patton wanted to prevent lasted until 1991. It cost trillions of dollars and killed millions in proxy wars across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe killed approximately 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile. The human cost of the Yalta agreements was measured in generations of oppression. Whether attacking the Soviet Union in May 1945 would have prevented this outcome is unknowable. Whether it was militarily possible is debatable. But that Patton correctly identified the threat before most American leaders would acknowledge it is undeniable.